Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland, and behind me is the house where Sir Francis Place spent much of the latter part of his life. Sorry, not Sir Francis, simply Francis Place. He was born at London in 1771. I'm here on Brompton Square in London. So he had the inestimable disadvantage for that time of being born outside of wedlock. Now, his father ran a sponging house, which is where debtors could go and they'd live there whilst they were trying to reach an agreement with their creditors. It wasn't a prison, but he was still responsible for them, but it was a way to make quite a good living. So Place's father was comfortably middle class. He wasn't completely abandoned by his father. So Place grew up in Drury Lane, London. There's the famous Drury Lane Theatre there, where God Save the King was performed for the very first time. But despite the famous theatre, it was still quite a run-down area. There were lanes off it which were slums into the early 20th century. There were a lot of people who were alcoholics, particularly drinking gin in those days. There were a lot of street prostitutes. So it's quite a rough and dangerous area that he grew up in. So he had himself apprenticed to a breech maker, as in trousers, but leather breeches he was making. So he was very skilled with his hands, and later became a tailor. But he was known for his outspoken advocacy of radical notions. So a lot of people wouldn't employ him for this reason, but he set up his own tailor's business, and as a haberdasher he prospered. He did very well in his trade, and he had a shop in the Strand, which was the street to have one in those days, as in Strand meaning beach, because it was right beside the River Thames. Remember, it's only in the 1860s that the embankment was built, so the Thames at that point used to be twice as wide as it is today. So it really was almost a beach. Just a few meters away was the water, and at low tide obviously you'd see the sand. Anyway, he married. He had sired 15 children, despite the fact he believed that population should be limited through means of contraception. They didn't specify what means was to be used, because that was for the province of, well, females. They were to decide. Men were not to concern themselves with these things, I suppose. Anyway, he joined the London Corresponding Society, which in the 1890s was advocating for major social reform, and it was corresponding because they were sending letters to each other and printed pamphlets, things which were not just generally on sale. It would be through subscription. Remember, back in those days, only about 5% of men had the right to vote, and they largely admired the French Revolution. They thought it had made a few mistakes, gone too far in some regards, but liberty should be expanded in the United Kingdom by the end to sectarian discrimination and by greater rights for more people, broader freedom of expression, and so forth. Anyway, he later split with them, despite having been briefly General Secretary. He felt that their views were too advanced in some cases, some of them saying we have to use force to achieve our ends because justice will be denied us if we agitate by peaceful means only. Moral force is insufficient. So he knew just about every radical writer or thinker in London in his lifetime, like James Stuart Mill and his son John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham MP, and he was an admirer of Sir Francis Burdett. So Burdett came from a wealthy upper-class family, but was a radical MP and helped do so much to pave the way for the Great Reform Act of 1832, or the Representation of the People Act as it's properly known. He was also friends with William Godwin, the author of Natural Justice, the father-in-law of Shelley. I'm not sure if he knew Shelley or some of those writers like that. So he lived in the Strand above the shop, but he later moved here. In the 1840s. This square wasn't built when he was born, way back in 1771. His first wife died. He got married to an actress much younger than himself the second time. I don't think any children from his second marriage. So he agreed with the Reverend Malthus about population, that population increases exponentially, but food supply only increases arithmetically. So you shouldn't provide too much welfare for the needy, because then they will be improvident and they will neglect their husbandry, not that kind of husbandry, and they will have more children they can provide for, and we'll just have another crash because of starvation. This positive check will simply starve people to death. And it might seem extraordinary to be so blasé about it these days, but back in the 1820s, a lot of people were on the edge of starvation most of the time in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Bear in mind, the UK was a relatively prosperous country. Lifespan was much shorter. People used to eat every morsel, so a lot of people were rather short and rather cadaverous because they've been so malnourished in childhood. bow legs and rickets and all the rest of it. They had an insufficiency of meat and milk, protein and calcium, at a formative stage of their development. Anyway, he later moved to Hammersmith, lived with two of his daughters who'd never wed, and that indeed where he died. He's laid to rest in Kensal Green Cemetery, London, and there's some column to the radicals, and his name is etched there with several others such as Charles Kingsley, because Kensal Green Cemetery had been open not very long before he died. He'd been involved in the Chartists, but again he'd split with them, didn't like the direction that Fergus O'Connor was taking it in. He was involved in the Anti-Corn Law League because there was this tax on imported corn to keep the price artificially high. Nice if you're a producer of corn in this country, but bad for everybody else because that was the staff of life. What supported the people was bread, and if you're making the staple food costlier, then that's really a stomach tax, they say. It's a really regressive tax because it hits the poorest hardest and simply redistributes wealth from the neediest to the wealthiest. So that is a little bit about Francis Place. Toodaloo.